Last week, we explored the anxious generation, a world where screens glow brighter than our stars, where dopamine is currency, and calm feels like a forgotten language. We asked, what's happening to us? Why are we the most connected species in history so disconnected inside? But today, we take that question deeper. Beneath the surface of anxiety, beneath culture, beneath even choice itself, lies something more fundamental. A mystery that scientists, philosophers, and poets have wrestled with for centuries. What if you never chose any of it? Not your fears, your dreams, your triumphs, not even your regrets. What if every decision you've ever made was the inevitable result of everything that came before? Your genes, your childhood, your neurons firing in patterns older than you are? In his groundbreaking book Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, Robert Sapolsky, primatologist, neuroscientist, and master storyteller, takes us to the edge of human understanding. Through decades of studying baboons in the African savannah and brains in Stanford labs, he makes a bold claim: free will is an illusion. But compassion doesn't have to be. Today, we'll journey through every chapter of Determined, unpacking how biology, history, and chance weave the fabric of who we are. We'll trace Sapolsky's own path from Brooklyn to the bush of Kenya and ask what it means to live a good life in a world without free will. So take a breath, and for the next few minutes, let curiosity be your compass. Because sometimes the most freeing discovery is realizing how little we were ever truly free. You only. Star author Robert Sapolsky.
You're choosing between Coke and Pepsi. You're choosing between invading this neighbor or that neighbor, whatever it is you're making. And you form an intent. You're consciously aware that you're making this decision. For most people, that's necessary and sufficient to say, that's it. There's free will. That's like 0.1% of what you need to be paying attention to. Because when you actually make a choice, you form an intent and you choose something. We're not thinking, how did I turn out to be somebody who would have that desire, that intent at that point? Unless you ask the question, how did they turn out to be the sort of person who would form that intent at that moment? And that's where all the free will disappears.
Determined, the illusion of free will. Based on Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will by Robert Sapolsky. Welcome back to the You Only Podcast, where we uncover the psychology, philosophy, and science behind the world's most profound ideas. I'm your host, Lo Jackson, and I want to thank every one of you who's been tuning in and sharing episodes and helping us grow into a global community of curious minds. Over 1,300 plays and 160 hours of listening in just the last month. That's not just numbers, that's connection. So thank you so much. Today's episode, Determined, is going to mess with your heads a little bit because by the end of it, you might not really believe in free will anymore. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're standing at a crossroads. Two paths, one choice. You take a deep breath and you shift to the left. Now stop. Did you make that decision? Or did a cocktail of hormones, neurons, and childhood experiences decide for you long before you ever chose? Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, one of Stanford's most brilliant and controversial minds, argues that free will is an illusion. That everything from our love lives to our tempers, our generosity to our crimes is simply the product of biology and circumstances. If you don't know Sapolsky, you should. He's not your average academic. He's a neurodocrinologist, primatologist, and professor of biology who spent decades studying stress, behavior, and the brain. His early works, like Behave, and Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, made him one of the world's leading voices on human and animal behavior. Determined, this book isn't just science, it's an existential earthquake. Sapolsky says, "You are not the driver of your life. You are the passenger watching the brain steer."
You only. Star author Robert Sapolsky.
For most people, it's going to be enormously liberating. Kids who have learning differences, we don't tell them anymore they're lazy. And the whole world is full of 40-year-olds who say, God, if I had gotten that dyslexia diagnosis when I was 10 instead of 40, I wouldn't have just spent my whole life hating myself.
Every decision you make, from the food you eat to the anger you feel, is the end result of an unfathomable, complex chain of events. Genes, hormones, prenatal nutrition, trauma, culture, and even the bacteria in your gut. Think about that for just 1 second. When you got angry last week, maybe in traffic or an argument, that wasn't you choosing anger. You were angry long before that. That was your amygdala firing based on stress hormones conditioned by upbringing and biological predispositions. Now, before your brain melts, don't worry. You didn't choose to listen to this podcast either. Your neurons just have impeccable taste. Let's get serious. If no one truly has free will, what does that mean for crime, justice, morality? In the U.S., over 2 million people are incarcerated. Yet neuroscientists show that over 90% of violent offenders have histories of trauma, neurological impairment, and genetic predisposition towards impulsivity. And a lot of times, I feel also, if a man hasn't been raised by another man who is a well-rounded, mature male, I believe, because I was raised like that with a single mom, and I know other men in my community that I grew up with that were raised by single moms, and we all lived on impulses and not maturity. If Sapolsky is right, they didn't choose their actions anymore. They choose your blood type. Punishment then becomes less about morality and more about public safety and rehabilitation. He argues that justice should evolve not as vengeance, but as neuroscientific compassion. And that's how I feel about all the police departments across America. They're doing these Zoom meetings with counselors and all these people, and they have all these open psychologists out there. I think every police officer in America needs a psychologist with them on hand, because a lot of us are going through mental stressors that we don't understand, or someone who can defuse situations. So here's the neuroscience behind Determined. Spolaski doesn't just philosophize. He backs this with hard science, studies with EEG and MRI scans that show the brain begins to act milliseconds before a person consciously decides to move or speak. Your brain has already made your decision before you even knew it. He references the famous Libet experiment, where subjects' motor cortex light up before they reported the intention of the act. Translation: your brain acts first, you catch up later. And that's what I pretty much got from that chapter in this book. Please, get out there and read this book. All of his books, really. I've looked at all of them. In reality, I'm going to go back and read both of the other ones too, because they seemed really interesting. I think you guys would enjoy them as well. And thank you for listening to the You Only podcast. And we're doing Determined by Robert Sapolsky. This book collides head-on with everything from religion to philosophy. Think of thinkers like Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And I covered that episode here on the You Only podcast. You found freedom in mental attitude, even in Auschwitz. Sapolsky challenges that. In this book, he pretty much he's asking, if trauma and biology shape our reactions, can we really choose meaning? Or Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, freedom is the will to become who you are. Sapolsky might say, You are always going to become who you are. Here's the paradox. Even if you know free will doesn't exist, you still have to live as it does. Otherwise, life becomes unbearable. Sapolsky isn't trying to make you hopeless. He's trying to make you empathetic. If no one truly chooses who they are, how can we hate or judge or condemn so easily? That understanding could change how we treat addiction, poverty, mental illness, and even ourselves. So, what does it mean to be you? If you never really had a choice in the first place, maybe you are the sum of every force that shaped you. And recognizing that might be the key to genuine compassion, forgiveness, and progress. But because if you were them, you'd do what they did every single time.
You only. Star author, Robert Sapolsky.
Your frontal cortex is the part of your brain that is the freest from genetic influences because it's still being sculpted by environment and experience a quarter century after you plopped out there, whereas most of the rest of your brain is sculpted by 2 or 3 years worth of experience. Whoa, our genes evolved to free our frontal cortex from strict genetic determinism and to make it much more sculpted by environmental determinism.
In chapter 1, Robert starts with turtles all the way down. It's a metaphor of turtles stacking beneath the world, the idea being infinite regress of causes. The phrase implies that there is no floating turtle, no point where causes stop and free will step in. Sapolsky argues that behavior is caused by prior biological, environmental, and historical influences reaching far back in time. He also addresses the emotional resistance many feel to rejecting free will, admitting even he struggles with fully embracing his implications. A big implication: praise, blame, moral distress, and retribution are called into question in chapter 1. If no one chooses their actions, how justified is moral punishment? In chapter 2, this chapter, neuroscience, genetics, and it talks about environment. He defines operationally what he means by free will and determination. For him, to have free will would be for behavior to, in some sense, arise independently of the sum of prior causes. That was my thought of chapter 2. Genetic and other influences, predispositions, gene-environment interactions, how genes do not rigidly determine but create vulnerabilities and propensities. Environment, nurture, and developmental issues, prenatal conditions, childhood trauma, socioeconomic status, stress, culture. For instance, early in life, adversity affect how PFC and limbic circuitry develop. He also engages with and criticizes more moderate philosophers who try to carve out wiggle room for free will. That's wild, right? He really had to stay focused and determined while writing this, because it was also causing him biases in his mind. Comparabilities, or those who argue for emergent higher order free will, he argues these often misunderstand how deeply causality pervades. Sapolsky cites neuroscience experiments that, the Libet experiment and his successors, that show brain activity preceding conscious decision reports. He refers studies linking childhood adversity, measured by ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience Score, with later antisocial behavior. Each point of ACE is correlated with a 35% higher risk of antisocial behavior or criminal activity in some studies. In prison populations, a disproportionate share of violent offenders have traumatic brain injury or prefrontal cortex damage. About half of violent offenders have histories of TBI versus 8% in general population in one-sided context. He discusses international binding experiments. If you were weaken belief in free will, people show weaker binding, less sense of urgency, in other words, and tasks involving button presses and paired outcomes as well. He also mentions meta-analytic review. 145 experiments, including unpublished, shows that manipulations that reduce belief in free will can shift people towards determinism, but without consistent effects on ethical behavior. Chapter 5 is it's the interlude pretty much of this book. It's chaos, complexity, quantum, and no cracks in determinism. And that's what I said earlier about him staying so focused. In the second major block, Sapolsky addresses common challenges to determinism: unpredictability, chaos, emergence, quantum mechanics, and argues none successfully rescue free will. Chaos theory and unpredictability. Some argue that even deterministic systems can be unpredictable. Small differences amplify. But Sapolsky says unpredictability does not imply indeterminism. Chaotic systems can still be fully caused. Emergent complexity. Philosophers sometimes argue that a higher level of organization, like mind consciousness, new rules emerge that are not reducible to lower levels. Sapolsky is skeptical that emergent phenomena can escape causality. Emergent does not mean uncaused. Quantum mechanics and indeterminism. Some try to use quantum indeterminacy, randomness at subatomic scales to open a gap for free will. Sapolsky argues that a quantum event is rather not controlled by by a will, so that doesn't give you freedom but randomness. And there's no good evidence that quantum randomness bubbles up to neural mental levels in a coherent way. He admits he is less emotionally invested in this section, but argues that none of these loopholes salvage free will at all. And he also responds to more moderate philosophers, the idea that luck evens out over time, so bad luck now is offset later. And many people think like that. He counters that luck compound and diverges. The idea that self-formation or reflection gives you control. He argues you can't step outside your biology to re-choose your biology, and that makes sense. The interlude is often cited as Pulaski's summarizing the first half that the turtles all the way down model means there is no real crack or space for free will to insert itself. So he asks, what happens if society stops believing in free will? Would morality collapse? Would people behave worse? Would meaning literally vanish? On morality and ethics, he suggests we should shift from retributive justice, punishing people because they deserve it, to a model based on prevention, rehabilitation, and incapacitation. Think of how we treat someone with a disease. We don't blame. We don't blame them for getting sick. We treat them. Similarly, in a deterministic view, crime is not desert. It's a consequence of causal chain. I talked about that earlier. On praise and blame, praise can still function as instrumental leverage, encouraging behavior, but not because someone deserved it inherently. On meaning, purpose, and motivation, Sapolsky wrestles with whether meaning collapses if free will is gone. He doesn't fully deny the possibility of meaning, but admits that a deterministic worldview challenges many human intuitions. And of course it does every day in every kind of situation we get ourselves into. And he examines empirical studies that try to test whether weakening belief in free will leads to worse behavior like cheating, aggression, and helping out less. Some earlier experiments suggested that undermining belief in free will leads people to cheat more or act less ethically. But meta-analysis find that the effects are inconsistent, often very small. And personal ethics are on somebody's values. Values then lead into morals, then into personal ethics. And if you don't know those things, please find the information you need and learn those tools, because you're missing out on a lot of great opportunities to be a better human being. He also draws analogies how science and society have already rejected old models, the way mental illness or epilepsy is no longer blamed on moral failure. We can shift those stigmas. Maybe we can shift how we see free will. He grapples with possible dangers as well. If people believe they have no control, will they stop trying? Will they feel alienated? Will social cohesion suffer? He argues these risks are real, but not decisive. As noted earlier, the 145 experiment meta-analysis that undermined earlier claims of strong behavioral change when free will belief is manipulated. Some of the early behavioral experiments, after exposure to anti-free will arguments, subjects were more likely to cheat, less likely to help, more aggressive, hot sauce tasks. Though these are contested and small in magnitude. So here's the overall gist or the takeaway. No crack for free will. Sapolsky's argument is that every part of human decision making is embedded in a seamless, causal chain, from nanoseconds to evolutionary history, leaving no plausible gap for free will to slip in. Unpredictability doesn't equal freedom. Just because human behavior is complex or not easy, forecastable doesn't mean it is free. Quantum randomness doesn't help. Random events aren't choices. They don't restore agency. Moral and social systems need reframing. If we accept minimal or no free will, we must rethink justice, blame, praise, and how we treat each other, focusing more on prevention, rehabilitation, social design, and compassion. And I feel like since so many people in the world are so angry and negative, everybody needs to read this book. Humans are emotionally invested. Sapolsky acknowledges that rejecting free will is psychologically and philosophically difficult. Many are reluctant to give up agency, meaning responsibility. So, with that said, empirical support is nuanced. While neuroscience and psychology offer strong evidence for determination, the path from data to sweeping philosophical claims is contested. Thank you guys for listening to the You Only podcast, and hopefully you've enjoyed Determined by Robert Sapolsky. This was a great read. Until next time.
To make sense of life, death, and everything in between? Then you need to tune in to the You Only podcast with your host, Lo Jackson. This isn't just another podcast. This is a movement, a deep dive into the human experience where real conversations meet raw emotion and truth gets personal. Lo Jackson keeps it real, asking the questions most are afraid to face and giving you tools to grow, think, and live boldly. So if you're ready to stop surviving and start living, You Only is where your journey begins. Subscribe now. New episodes drop weekly. Available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen.